They said she was too soft to make a difference. The critics dismissed her quiet demeanor, her gentle voice, her preference for books over bold proclamations. But in the dusty town of Crawford, Texas, Laura Bush was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from those who shout the loudest, but from those who act with unwavering purpose when it matters most. What happened next would transform not just a struggling community, but challenge everything people thought they knew about true leadership. Comment where you're watching from today, and let's dive into a story that will change how you see quiet strength forever. The summer heat in Crawford, Texas pressed down like a heavy blanket, turning the main street into a shimmering mirage of cracked asphalt and faded storefronts. This was 2003, and the small town of barely 1,500 souls had found itself thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight. With the president's ranch just miles away, Crawford had become a temporary stage for the world's attention, but beneath the media circus and Secret Service presence, the real story was unfolding in the shadows of struggling families and forgotten dreams. Laura Bush stepped out of her modest sedan outside the Crawford Community Center, her blue cotton dress simple and unpretentious. Unlike the elaborate motorcades and security details that usually announce political arrivals, she had chosen to drive herself this morning, wanting to experience the town as its residents did every day. The former librarian adjusted her reading glasses and surveyed the scene before her with the same quiet intensity she had once brought to organizing library collections back in Austin. The community center stood as a testament to both ambition and disappointment. Built in the 1970s with federal grants and community hope, it had once been the heart of Crawford's social life. Now, paint peeled from its walls like old sunburn, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had weathered to a dull gray. A hand-painted sign by the entrance read, "Crawford Community Center, all welcome," but the faded letters seemed to whisper of better times that had slipped away. Inside, the air conditioning wheezed against the Texas heat, providing only marginal relief. Folding chairs were arranged in uneven rows, some missing legs or sporting tears in their vinyl seats. About 30 residents had gathered for what they believed was simply another political photo opportunity, another chance for important people to make promises they wouldn't keep. Their faces reflected the weariness of people who had been disappointed too many times to believe in easy solutions. At the front of the room, Brent Christensen paced nervously. As the town's mayor, he had reluctantly agreed to this meeting, though he harbored deep skepticism about any meaningful change coming from it. At 58, Brent had watched Crawford's decline for decades. The farming community had been hit hard by drought, economic downturns, and the consolidation of agriculture into massive corporate operations. Small family farms had withered like crops in the unforgiving sun, and with them had gone much of the town's economic foundation. Brent cleared his throat and attempted a welcoming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Folks, I appreciate you all coming out this morning. As you know, we've got Mrs. Bush here to talk with us about, well, I suppose we'll see what she has to say." His introduction carried the tone of a man who had presided over too many failed initiatives and empty promises. Laura Bush rose from her seat in the front row, moving with the unhurried grace of someone comfortable in her own skin. She hadn't prepared elaborate remarks or brought policy papers. Instead, she carried only a small notebook and the kind of presence that came from years of listening more than speaking. As she turned to face the gathered residents, her expression held none of the practiced political smile they expected. Instead, her eyes moved slowly across the room, making genuine contact with individuals, acknowledging their presence not as a crowd to be addressed, but as people to be understood. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying the warm cadences of Texas but without any trace of performance. I want to start by saying thank you for taking time out of your day to be here. I know that time is precious, especially when there's work to be done and families to care for. From the third row, Denise Strong shifted uncomfortably in her seat. At 45, she worked 2 jobs to support her 3 children, cleaning houses during the day and stocking shelves at the local market at night. Her husband had left 3 years earlier when the farm equipment dealership where he'd worked for 15 years finally closed its doors. Denise had grown tired of politicians who spoke about working families while clearly having no idea what that actually meant. "We've heard a lot of talk over the years," Denise said, her voice carrying the edge of someone who had learned to be direct out of necessity. "Lot of people come through here promising this and that, but when the cameras leave, we're still here dealing with the same problems." Laura Bush nodded slowly, and instead of offering immediate reassurance or deflecting the challenge, she remained silent for a moment, letting Denise's words settle in the warm air. "You're absolutely right," she finally said. "And I imagine you have good reason to be skeptical of someone like me coming here with ideas about how things should change." The honesty of her response created a subtle shift in the room's energy. This wasn't the usual political deflection or the patronizing tone they had come to expect from visiting officials. Alan Johnson, who ran the town's struggling hardware store, leaned forward slightly. At 62, he had inherited the business from his father and had watched it slowly lose customers to big box stores in Waco and Dallas. He had been preparing to close permanently at the end of the year. "Mrs. Bush," Alan said, his voice measured and respectful but firm. "With all due respect, you're talking to people who've been forgotten. This town's been dying for years, and I'm not sure there's anything left to save." The weight of his words hung in the air like smoke. Several residents nodded in quiet agreement. Barbara Jackson, a retired teacher who had spent 40 years in Crawford schools, felt tears prick at her eyes. She had watched generations of students leave town after graduation, never to return, taking their dreams and potential with them to places where opportunities still existed. Laura Bush walked slowly toward the center of the room, her movement deliberate and unhurried. "Mr. Johnson, may I ask you something? What made you want to keep the hardware store open as long as you have?" Alan seemed surprised by the question. He had expected either false promises or political platitudes, not genuine curiosity about his personal motivations. "Well, my father built that business from nothing, and people they used to need." He paused, struggling to articulate something he had never been asked to explain before. "They need a place where someone knows their name," Laura Bush said gently. "Where someone remembers that Jennifer Kelly's fence gate has been sticking for months, or that Cole Harris always needs a specific type of screw for his tractor repairs." Alan stared at her, startled by the accuracy of her observation. "How did you—" "Because I've lived in small towns," she replied. "I understand that a hardware store isn't just about selling screws and paint. It's about relationships. It's about being part of the fabric that holds a community together." From the back of the room, Dennis Porter watched this exchange with growing interest. As the town's postal worker, he had a unique perspective on Crawford's struggles. He delivered mail to empty houses, forwarded addresses to people who had moved away, and witnessed firsthand the slow hemorrhaging of the community's population. But he had also seen the small acts of kindness that persisted even in hard times, the way neighbors still looked out for each other even when resources were scarce. "Mrs. Bush," Dennis said, standing up slowly, "assuming you're not just here for a photo opportunity, what exactly are you proposing?" The directness of his question created another moment of tension. This was the moment when most political figures would launch into prepared talking points about economic development or federal programs. Instead, Laura Bush returned to her seat and opened her small notebook. "I'm not proposing anything yet," she said. "I'm here to listen, to understand what this community needs, what it has to offer, and what might be possible if we approached things differently." Jacqueline Stevens, who worked at the elementary school as a teacher's aide, felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years. Curiosity mixed with cautious hope. "What do you mean, approached things differently?" Laura Bush's response revealed the depth of thought she had already given to Crawford's situation. "I mean, starting with what you have, not what you lack. Every community has assets, people, skills, history, natural resources, connections. Sometimes we get so focused on what's missing that we can't see what's already here." The conversation continued for another hour, but something fundamental had shifted in that small, overheated community center. Laura Bush didn't make grand promises or unveil elaborate plans. Instead, she asked questions that revealed she had done her homework. She knew about the town's agricultural history, its struggles with drought, the closure of key businesses, and the demographics of population loss. But she also asked about things that surprised the residents, about traditions they maintained, skills they possessed, and connections they had never thought to leverage. When the meeting ended, people didn't rush to leave. Instead, small groups formed naturally, continuing conversations that had been sparked by questions they hadn't been asked in years. What did they love about Crawford? What would they fight to preserve? What skills did they have that might be valuable in ways they hadn't considered? As Laura Bush prepared to leave, Brent Christensen approached her with a mixture of confusion and growing respect. "Mrs. Bush, I have to admit, this wasn't what I expected." She smiled, and for the first time that morning it was the full, genuine expression of someone who felt hopeful about what she had witnessed. "Mayor Christensen, I have a feeling this town is going to surprise a lot of people." As her car pulled away from the community center, Laura Bush was already making mental notes about follow-up calls she needed to make. But the residents of Crawford stood in the parking lot longer than usual, talking among themselves with an energy that had been absent for months. They didn't yet know what would come next, but something had begun that morning that felt different from all the false starts and broken promises of the past. In the weeks that followed, word spread through Crawford about the meeting at the community center. People who hadn't been able to attend sought out those who had, wanting to know what had actually been discussed. The conversation had been so different from typical political encounters that some residents struggled to explain exactly what had happened. There had been no announcements, no programs unveiled, no funding promised. And yet, somehow, something significant had occurred. What none of them realized yet was that Laura Bush had returned to Washington with a different kind of agenda than they might have expected. She wasn't planning to announce a federal program or arrange for government funding. Instead, she was beginning to make calls to a network of contacts they didn't know she possessed. People in foundations, universities, and corporations who might be interested in what she had seen in Crawford. People who understood that sometimes the most effective change happens not through grand government initiatives, but through the quiet mobilization of resources and relationships in service of a community ready to help itself. The seeds of something unprecedented had been planted in that overheated community center, though no one yet understood what might grow from them. Laura Bush had seen something in Crawford that the residents themselves had begun to forget, not just their problems, but their potential. And she was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most powerful leadership comes not from those who make the loudest promises, but from those who understand how to turn quiet strength into transformative action. As summer turned toward fall, Crawford settled back into its familiar routines, but with an undercurrent of anticipation that hadn't been there before. People found themselves paying attention to conversations they might have previously ignored, noticing skills and resources they had taken for granted, and beginning to imagine possibilities they had long since dismissed as unrealistic. They didn't know it yet, but their quiet visitor had set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their town's future, and everything the world thought it knew about the power of gentle persistence in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. 3 weeks after that pivotal meeting at the community center, Crawford's residents began to notice subtle changes that they couldn't quite explain. It started with phone calls that seemed almost too good to be true. Denise Strong was stocking shelves at Millfields Market when her phone rang during her evening shift. The voice on the other end introduced herself as Dr. Christina Dixon from the University of Texas Rural Development Institute, and she was calling about something called the Crawford Community Initiative. "Mrs. Strong," Dr. Dixon said, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone genuinely excited about her work, "I understand you've been managing quite a bit on your own with 3 children. Mrs. Bush mentioned that you have experience in both retail management and bookkeeping from when you helped your husband with his business before the dealership closed." Denise nearly dropped the box of cereal she was holding. No one had called her business experience valuable in years. After her husband left, people in town had looked at her with a mixture of pity and judgment, as if being abandoned somehow reflected a personal failure. The idea that someone was interested in her skills rather than her circumstances felt almost foreign. "I don't understand," Denise replied cautiously. "What kind of initiative?" Dr. Dixon explained that she was part of a university team that specialized in rural economic development, and they had been contacted about Crawford's potential for something called asset-based community development. Instead of focusing on what the town lacked, they wanted to identify and build upon existing strengths, skills, and resources that residents might not have recognized as valuable. "We'd like to conduct what we call a skills inventory," Dr. Dixon continued. "We're particularly interested in people like you who have managed multiple responsibilities and developed diverse skill sets. Would you be willing to participate in a conversation about what you know and what you might be interested in learning?" Meanwhile, across town, Alan Johnson was closing up his hardware store when a black SUV pulled up outside. He had grown accustomed to occasional Secret Service sweeps of the area, but this vehicle was different. A woman in her 30s stepped out, carrying what appeared to be architectural plans and a digital camera. She introduced herself as Emily Hawkins, a rural development specialist with connections to both government and private funding sources. "Mr. Johnson," Emily said, extending her hand with a firm grip, "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit. Mrs. Bush mentioned that you have an intimate knowledge of this building and the infrastructure throughout Crawford. I'm here because we're exploring the possibility of adaptive reuse projects that could serve multiple community functions." Alan looked puzzled. Adaptive reuse. Emily unrolled the plans on the hood of her SUV, revealing detailed architectural drawings of buildings that looked remarkably similar to structures throughout Crawford. These are examples of how small towns have transformed existing buildings into multi-purpose community assets. A hardware store, for instance, might maintain its retail function while also serving as a maker space, a small business incubator, or a skills training center. As Emily explained the concept, Alan found himself looking at his store with new eyes. The back room that had been gathering dust could potentially house equipment for woodworking or small manufacturing. The knowledge he possessed about construction, repair, and problem-solving wasn't just useful for selling screws and paint. It was expertise that could be taught, shared, and leveraged in ways he had never considered. But who would fund something like that? Alan asked, his natural skepticism warring with a growing sense of possibility. Emily smiled. That's where things get interesting. Mrs. Bush has been making some very strategic phone calls. The next morning, Dennis Porter was beginning his mail route when he encountered something unusual at the community center. Several vehicles with out-of-state license plates were parked outside, and people were carrying equipment into the building. His curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to investigate. Inside, he found a scene of organized activity that the building hadn't witnessed in years. A team of researchers from the Texas Rural Policy Institute was setting up laptops and interview stations. Their leader, an energetic woman named Kristen Dudley, explained that they were conducting what she called a community asset mapping project. "Mr. Porter," Kristen said after Dennis introduced himself, "we understand you have a unique perspective on this community. As the postal worker, you probably know more about the actual social networks and connections in Crawford than anyone else." Dennis had never thought about his job in those terms, but as Kristen explained their research methodology, he began to understand how his daily observations could provide valuable insights into community resilience and resource sharing. He knew which families helped each other during tough times, which residents had skills they weren't using, and which houses had been quietly converted into small businesses or workshops. The researchers weren't just collecting data for academic purposes. They were identifying patterns and connections that could be leveraged for economic development. Dennis found himself sharing observations that he had never articulated before. How Anna Church had been quietly tutoring high school students in her living room. How Edwin Adams had been repairing small appliances for neighbors in his garage. How April Johnson had been growing and selling herbs to restaurants in Waco. These weren't formal businesses. They were informal economic activities that had emerged organically, but had never been recognized or supported as potential foundations for larger economic development. The researchers were documenting them as evidence that Crawford had more entrepreneurial activity than traditional economic indicators suggested. As the week progressed, word spread through Crawford about the various teams that had descended upon the town. Unlike previous outside interventions that had felt invasive or patronizing, these researchers and specialists seemed genuinely interested in understanding what residents already knew and did well. They asked questions that made people think about their skills and knowledge in new ways. Barbara Jackson, the retired teacher, found herself in conversation with Leah McMillan, an education consultant who specialized in rural literacy programs. Leah had been recommended by Laura Bush, who remembered Barbara's decades of dedication to Crawford students and her frustration with watching talented young people leave town because they saw no opportunities to stay. "Mrs. Jackson," Leah said as they sat in Barbara's living room, surrounded by the books that had accumulated over 40 years of teaching. "Mrs. Bush mentioned that you have extensive experience with both traditional education and informal learning networks. We're exploring the possibility of establishing Crawford as a pilot site for innovative rural education models." Barbara felt a familiar surge of excitement that she hadn't experienced since her retirement. "What kind of models?" Leah explained that they were looking at communities where traditional schools could partner with local businesses and skilled residents to create apprenticeship programs, where online learning could be combined with hands-on mentoring, and where young people could develop skills that were both marketable beyond Crawford and valuable for local economic development. "The goal," Leah continued, "would be to create pathways for young people to stay in Crawford if they choose to, while also ensuring they have skills that could take them anywhere. It's about choice rather than necessity." The concept resonated deeply with Barbara, who had always believed that education should be about expanding possibilities rather than limiting them. She began to envision programs where students could learn digital marketing by helping local businesses develop online presence, where they could study environmental science through agricultural sustainability projects, where they could develop leadership skills by organizing community events and initiatives. By the end of the month, Crawford was buzzing with a kind of energy that longtime residents struggled to describe. It wasn't the false excitement of a political campaign or the desperate hope of a get-rich-quick scheme. Instead, it felt like the gradual awakening of potential that had been dormant for years. Justin Murphy, who had been running a small auto repair business out of his garage, found himself in discussions with economic development specialists about the possibility of expanding into a full-service automotive training center. His skills weren't just useful for fixing cars. They represented knowledge about engines, electronics, and problem-solving that could be taught to others and leveraged for broader economic impact. Lisa Robinson, who had been cleaning houses since her divorce, discovered that her organizational skills and attention to detail were being viewed as expertise in facility management and small business operations. She was invited to participate in discussions about property maintenance contracts for the various projects being planned throughout Crawford. Joseph Kemp, a veteran who had been struggling with unemployment since returning from Iraq, found himself connected with programs that recognized his leadership training and technical skills as valuable assets for community development. Instead of being seen as someone who needed help, he was being recruited as someone who could provide leadership and expertise. The transformation wasn't happening through grand announcements or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Instead, it was occurring through hundreds of individual conversations, each one helping residents see themselves and their community through new eyes. People who had felt forgotten or left behind were discovering that they possessed knowledge, skills, and connections that others found valuable. Laura Bush had orchestrated this awakening not through political speeches or policy proposals, but through the careful mobilization of networks and resources that most people didn't know existed. She had connected Crawford with universities, foundations, and organizations that specialized in asset-based community development, but she had done so in a way that preserved local autonomy and decision-making authority. The real genius of her approach was becoming clear. Instead of imposing solutions from outside, she had created conditions for solutions to emerge from within the community itself. The experts and resources she had brought to Crawford weren't there to tell residents what to do, but to help them recognize and develop what they were already capable of doing. As autumn deepened, the various initiatives that had begun with that Verse Community Center meetings started to coalesce into something larger and more coordinated. Residents found themselves participating in planning sessions, skills-sharing workshops, and visioning exercises that felt fundamentally different from previous community development efforts. The difference was ownership. These weren't programs being delivered to Crawford. They were initiatives being developed by Crawford residents with expert support and external resources. People felt invested because they were genuinely involved in creating something that reflected their own values, priorities, and vision for their community's future. But even as excitement grew about these emerging possibilities, not everyone in Crawford was convinced that sustainable change was possible. Some residents remained skeptical, having been disappointed too many times before. Others worried that outside attention would eventually fade, leaving them with raised expectations and unfinished projects. These concerns weren't unfounded. Rural communities across America were littered with the remnants of well-intentioned development efforts that had promised transformation but delivered only temporary activity followed by renewed disappointment. What made this situation different wasn't immediately apparent, even to the people involved in creating it. What was becoming clear, however, was that Laura Bush had understood something fundamental about community development that many policy makers missed. Sustainable change requires not just resources and good intentions, but the careful cultivation of local capacity and leadership. She had created conditions for that cultivation to occur, but the actual growth would have to come from Crawford itself. As winter approached, the town faced its first real test. Would the momentum that had been building through the fall sustain itself through the slower months ahead? Would the various projects and initiatives that had been launched continue to develop, or would they join the long list of promising beginnings that had never reached fruition? The answer would depend on whether Crawford's residents had truly internalized the lesson that Laura Bush had been quietly teaching them, that their community's future didn't depend on waiting for someone else to save them, but on their own willingness to recognize their strengths, develop their capacity, and work together toward a vision they created for themselves. The foundation had been laid, the connections had been made, and the resources had been identified. But the real work was just beginning, and it would require the kind of sustained commitment and collaborative effort that would test everything Crawford thought it knew about itself and its possibilities. Winter arrived in Crawford with an unusual intensity that tested both the town's infrastructure and its newfound optimism. The old heating system at the community center failed during the first major cold snap of December, leaving the building that had become the hub of so much activity frigid and unusable. For many residents, this felt like a familiar pattern. Just as something good began to develop, reality would reassert itself and remind them why hope was a dangerous luxury in a place like Crawford. But instead of the resigned acceptance that had characterized previous setbacks, something different happened. Alan Johnson found himself standing in the community center's main room at 7 in the morning, his breath visible in the cold air, studying the ancient heating system with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for the most challenging repair jobs at his hardware store. He wasn't alone. Dennis Porter had arrived shortly after dawn, carrying a toolbox and wearing the determined expression of someone who had decided that this problem was not going to defeat them. "The whole system's shot," Alan said, running his hand along the corroded pipes that snaked along the building's foundation. "This thing was installed sometime in the Carter administration, and it's been limping along on prayers and duct tape ever since." Dennis nodded, but instead of the resigned shrug that might have accompanied such an assessment 6 months earlier, he pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. "Let me call Jake Cowan. He's been doing HVAC work up in Waco, but he grew up here. And I think Christopher Fletcher might know something about financing for this kind of project." What happened over the next 48 hours revealed how profoundly Crawford had changed since Laura Bush's initial visit. Instead of waiting for outside help or accepting the setback as insurmountable, residents began mobilizing resources and connections they were only beginning to understand they possessed. The phone calls that Dennis made led to other phone calls, which led to consultations, cost estimates, and the kind of collaborative problem-solving that had been dormant in Crawford for years. Jake Cowan drove down from Waco that evening, bringing not just his expertise, but connections to suppliers who could provide equipment at cost. Christopher Fletcher, who had been quietly developing relationships with regional funding sources, through the initiatives that had grown out of Laura Bush's intervention, was able to identify grant programs that could cover a significant portion of the replacement costs. Most importantly, residents who had been learning to see their skills as valuable assets began volunteering labor, coordination, and support services that dramatically reduced the project's overall expense. But the heating crisis also revealed something that the community development specialists had been quietly concerned about. There were residents who remained deeply skeptical of the changes occurring in Crawford, and some who actively opposed what they saw as outside interference in their community's affairs. The opposition crystallized around a figure who had been largely absent from the earlier initiatives: Walter Lyons, a rancher whose family had been in the area for 3 generations and who viewed the recent activity in town with growing suspicion and resentment. Walter had watched the parade of university researchers, development consultants, and grant specialists with the skeptical eye of someone who had seen too many outsiders arrive with promises of transformation. At 67, he had survived droughts, market crashes, and family tragedies by relying on self-sufficiency and traditional approaches to problems. The idea that Crawford needed to reinvent itself felt like an indictment of everything he and his generation had built. "This whole thing is nonsense," Walter declared during an impromptu meeting at the Millfields Market, where several residents had gathered to coordinate the heating repair project. "We've gotten along fine for decades without needing experts from Austin to tell us who we are and what we're capable of. Now suddenly everyone's got big ideas about transformation and development. What happens when these people get bored and move on to the next project?" His words struck a nerve with some residents who had been harboring similar concerns. Tabitha Wilson, who worked part-time at the school cafeteria, nodded in agreement. "My grandmother lived through the Depression without any development consultants. People here know how to take care of themselves. All this talk about assets and initiatives, it sounds like we're being told we weren't good enough the way we were." The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of Crawford's renaissance finally erupted during a town meeting called to discuss the community center heating project. What should have been a straightforward discussion about repair logistics became a confrontation between competing visions of the town's future and identity. Brent Christensen, the mayor who had gradually become a supporter of the development initiatives, attempted to moderate between the factions. "Look, we can all agree that we need heat in the community center. The question is whether we're going to fix this as a community or wait for someone else to solve our problems." Walter Lyons stood up, his weathered face flushed with frustration. "Mayor, with all due respect, we've been solving our own problems for generations. We don't need Mrs. Bush or her friends from the university to tell us how to be a community." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a winter fire. For the first time since the initiatives had begun, residents were forced to confront a fundamental question about what was happening in their town. Were they being empowered to solve their own problems, or were they being subtly colonized by outside experts who saw them as a project rather than as people? Denise Strong, who had become one of the most active participants in the skills development programs, felt compelled to respond. "Walter, I understand your concerns, but let me ask you something. When's the last time anyone asked you what you thought this town needed? When's the last time anyone seemed interested in what you knew or what you could teach others?" Her question was pointed, but not accusatory. Over the months since Laura Bush's initial visit, Denise had discovered that her experiences managing a household, working multiple jobs, and maintaining relationships during crisis had given her skills that were valuable in ways she had never considered. She had been recruited to help coordinate several of the community development projects, and for the first time in years, she felt useful in ways that extended beyond simple survival. "I've lived here my whole life," Walter replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades of frustration. "I've seen people come and go with big plans and bigger promises. They take pictures, write reports, get their grants funded, and then disappear. We're left with the same problems, plus a bunch of false hopes." The argument that followed revealed deep divisions within Crawford that the excitement of new possibilities had temporarily obscured. Some residents genuinely believed that the community needed to adapt and evolve to survive in a changing economic landscape. Others felt that such adaptation represented a betrayal of the values and traditions that had sustained their families through previous difficulties. Alan Johnson found himself in an unexpected position as a voice of moderation. "Walter, I've been thinking about closing my store for months. The way things were going, I figured I'd be out of business by Christmas. But these programs, They've helped me see possibilities I hadn't considered. Maybe there's a way to honor what we've always been while also becoming something more. The phrase "something more" became a focal point for the debate. What did it mean for Crawford to become something more? Did it require abandoning the characteristics that had defined the community for generations? Or could change and tradition coexist in ways that strengthened rather than undermined local identity? Laura Bush had anticipated this kind of resistance, though she had hoped it might emerge later in the process when the benefits of the development initiatives had become more apparent. She had seen similar dynamics in other communities where asset-based development had been attempted. The challenge was always to demonstrate that external support could enhance rather than replace local capacity and decision-making authority. When she received a call from Brent Christensen about the escalating tensions in Crawford, Laura Bush made a decision that surprised many of the development professionals who had been working with the community. Instead of sending additional experts or attempting to mediate the conflict from a distance, she announced that she would return to Crawford for a second community meeting. The announcement created a stir that extended far beyond the town's boundaries. Media outlets that had largely ignored Crawford's quiet transformation suddenly took notice. Political commentators debated whether Laura Bush was overstepping her role or demonstrating genuine leadership. Critics accused her of using a small Texas town as a laboratory for untested development theories. Supporters praised her commitment to seeing the initiative through despite political risks. But for the residents of Crawford, Laura Bush's decision to return felt like something more significant than political theater. It suggested that their community and their concerns were important enough to warrant the personal attention of someone who had no obligation to involve herself in their local disputes. The second community meeting was scheduled for a cold January evening at the newly repaired community center. The heating system hummed efficiently, a tangible reminder of what the community could accomplish when it mobilized its collective resources and skills. But the warm building could not entirely dispel the chill that had settled over Crawford's development initiatives. More residents attended this meeting than had come to the original gathering 6 months earlier. Word had spread throughout the county about the conflict brewing in Crawford, and people were curious to witness what felt like a crucial moment in the town's evolution. Some came as supporters of the development initiatives, others as skeptics, and many as genuinely undecided observers trying to understand what was at stake. Laura Bush arrived without fanfare, driving herself in the same modest sedan she had used for her first visit. She carried the same small notebook, but her demeanor suggested someone who understood that this meeting would be more challenging than her initial introduction to the community. The stakes had been raised, and the goodwill that had characterized her first encounter with Crawford residents could no longer be taken for granted. She began not with prepared remarks, but with an acknowledgement of the tensions that had brought them together. I understand that some of you have concerns about the changes that have been occurring in Crawford. I want to start by saying that those concerns are valid and important. Change can be threatening, especially when it feels like it's being imposed from outside. Walter Lyons, who had positioned himself prominently in the front row, nodded approvingly. This was more like what he had expected from the beginning, recognition that outside intervention carried risks and complications that enthusiastic development professionals often overlooked. But I also want to share something with you, Laura Bush continued. Over the past 6 months, I've received calls and reports from the people who have been working with Crawford. They've told me about innovations, collaborations, and problem-solving that have impressed experts who work with communities across the country. They've described residents who have demonstrated leadership, creativity, and resilience that many communities lack. She paused, letting her words settle in the warm air of the repaired community center. What I want to discuss tonight is not whether Crawford should change, but who gets to decide what that change looks like. The question reframed the entire debate in ways that caught both supporters and critics off guard. Instead of defending the development initiatives or arguing for their continuation, Laura Bush was proposing that the community itself should have ultimate authority over its own future. The role of external experts, funding sources and support systems would be to serve whatever vision Crawford residents created for themselves. "Walter," she said, addressing the rancher directly, "you've expressed concerns about outside interference. I'd like to ask you a question. If you could design a development strategy for Crawford that honored your family's history here, while also creating opportunities for your grandchildren to stay if they choose to, what would that look like?" The question was simultaneously respectful and challenging. It acknowledged Walter's concerns while also asking him to move beyond opposition toward constructive engagement with the community's future. It suggested that tradition and innovation might not be mutually exclusive if the community itself controlled the terms of its own development. What followed was a conversation that lasted nearly 3 hours and touched on fundamental questions about community identity, economic necessity, and the relationship between local autonomy and external support. Residents who had been talking past each other for months finally began engaging in the kind of substantive dialogue that Laura Bush had been quietly fostering since her first visit to Crawford. By the end of the evening, no dramatic resolutions had been reached, but something important had shifted in the community's understanding of its own agency and authority. The development initiatives would continue, but with enhanced mechanisms for local oversight and direction. External experts would remain available as resources, but their role would be explicitly defined as advisory rather than directive. Most importantly, Crawford had learned something crucial about itself. It possessed not just the skills and resources necessary for economic development, but the civic capacity to manage complex decisions and navigate competing interests. The conflict that had threatened to derail the community's progress had instead revealed depths of engagement and commitment that even the most optimistic development professionals had not anticipated. As residents filed out of the community center into the cold January night, they carried with them a new understanding of what community development actually meant. Not the imposition of external solutions, but the cultivation of local capacity to create and implement community-generated visions for the future. The spring of 2004 brought with it a series of events that would test everything Crawford had learned about itself over the previous 9 months. It began with an unexpected crisis that seemed to validate Walter Lyon's warnings about the dangers of depending on outside support and complex development initiatives. The Texas Rural Policy Institute, which had been coordinating much of the research and technical assistance for Crawford's projects, lost its primary funding source when a major foundation shifted its priorities away from rural development. The news arrived on a Tuesday morning in March through a phone call to Brent Christensen from Kristen Dudley, who had become the primary liaison between the university and the community. Her voice carried the strain of someone delivering bad news she had hoped never to share. "Mayor Christensen," she said, "I need to let you know that our funding situation has changed dramatically. The foundation that was supporting our work in Crawford has decided to redirect their resources toward urban education initiatives. We're going to have to scale back our involvement significantly." For a moment, Brent felt the familiar sinking sensation that had accompanied so many disappointments. Over the years, this was exactly what Walter Lyons had predicted. that outside supporters would eventually lose interest and move on to more fashionable causes, leaving Crawford to deal with the consequences of raised expectations and half-completed projects. But as Brent absorbed the news, he realized that his response was different from what it would have been a year earlier. Instead of resignation and defeat, he felt something closer to determination. The initiatives that had been launched in Crawford weren't just university projects anymore. They had become community projects that residents had learned to manage and direct themselves. "Kristin," he said, "I appreciate you letting us know, but I think you might be surprised by how well Crawford can handle this." His confidence wasn't misplaced. Over the previous months, residents had gradually assumed greater responsibility for the various projects and programs that had emerged. From Laura Bush's intervention, what had begun as external initiatives had evolved into locally owned and operated enterprises that drew on outside expertise, but weren't dependent on outside control or ongoing support. Alan Johnson's hardware store had become the unofficial headquarters for what residents now called the Crawford Maker Collective, a combination workshop, business incubator, and skills sharing center that operated out of his expanded back room. The transformation hadn't required major capital investment or elaborate planning. Instead, it had grown organically as residents like Justin Murphy began offering automotive repair classes, as Denise Strong started teaching bookkeeping workshops, and as retired machinist Tyler Donaldson began mentoring high school students. In metalworking, the collective generated enough revenue through classes, small manufacturing projects, and equipment rental to cover its operating expenses and even provide modest income to its instructors. More importantly, it had become a gathering place where residents shared knowledge, collaborated on projects, and developed the kind of social connections that strengthened the community's overall resilience. When news of the funding crisis spread through Crawford, the response revealed how fundamentally the town's approach to problem-solving had changed. Instead of waiting for solutions to emerge from external sources, residents immediately began organizing their own response. Barbara Jackson called an emergency meeting at the community center, but this time she wasn't waiting for outside experts to facilitate the discussion. "We've learned how to do this ourselves," she announced to the 47 residents who gathered on short notice. "The question isn't whether we can continue without university support. The question is what we want to accomplish and how we're going to make it happen." The meeting that followed demonstrated capabilities that had been developing quietly over the previous months. Residents had learned to facilitate productive discussions, to identify and leverage resources, and to make collective decisions that balanced competing interests and priorities. They had internalized the asset-based development approach so thoroughly that they applied it instinctively to their new challenge. Dennis Porter, who had become skilled at mapping community connections and resources, led a systematic assessment of Crawford's current capacity. The inventory revealed assets that would have been invisible a year earlier. The town now had residents trained in grant writing, project management, small business development, and conflict resolution. It had established relationships with suppliers, customers, and partners in surrounding communities. Most importantly, it had developed the confidence and experience necessary to pursue its own vision of development without depending on external validation or support. Lisa Robinson, whose organizational skills had been recognized and developed through the various initiatives, proposed the creation of what she called the Crawford Community Development Corporation, a locally controlled entity that could pursue funding, manage projects and coordinate activities without requiring ongoing university involvement. "We know what we're capable of now," she said. "We've proven that we can work together, solve problems, and create opportunities. Why do we need anyone else to tell us what to do?" The proposal sparked intense discussion, but not the kind of divisive conflict that had characterized earlier debates about Crawford's future. Walter Lyons, who had been the most vocal critic of outside involvement, found himself in the unexpected position of supporting greater local autonomy and self-determination. "I've been saying all along that we need to control our own destiny," he said. "If these folks have learned how to do that, then maybe I was wrong about some things." His admission marked a crucial turning point in Crawford's development. The opposition that had threatened to derail the community's progress had been transformed into support for local ownership and decision-making authority. The conflict that had once divided residents had become a source of strength and unity. Over the following weeks, Crawford residents demonstrated their newfound capacity through a series of initiatives that surprised even their most optimistic supporters. The Community Development Corporation was formally established with Lisa Robinson as its first director, and a board that included both longtime skeptics like Walter Lyons and enthusiastic supporters like Denise Strong. The organization immediately began pursuing funding opportunities that the university researchers had identified, but never had the local authority to pursue. More significantly, Crawford began attracting attention from other rural communities that were facing similar challenges. Word had spread through informal networks about the small Texas town that had learned to mobilize its own resources and create opportunities without waiting for outside salvation. Delegations began arriving from communities in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, wanting to understand how Crawford's transformation had occurred and whether it could be replicated elsewhere. These visits provided both validation and economic opportunity. Residents found themselves being paid to share their expertise with other communities, to facilitate workshops and training sessions, and to consult on development projects across the region. Barbara Jackson developed a curriculum for rural education, innovation that was adopted by school districts in 3 states. Alan Johnson's adaptive reuse model for small-town retail spaces became a template for hardware store owners throughout rural Texas. The transformation of Crawford from a struggling community seeking outside help to a regional center of expertise and innovation represented the kind of success that development professionals rarely witness. But the real measure of change wasn't in economic indicators or media attention. It was in the quiet confidence with which residents approached challenges and opportunities. When the county announced plans to close the rural health clinic that served Crawford and surrounding communities, residents didn't organize protest meetings or petition for government intervention. Instead, they immediately began researching alternative models for rural healthcare delivery. Within 6 weeks, they had developed a proposal for a community-owned clinic that would combine traditional medical services with wellness programs, preventive care, and health education. The proposal attracted the attention of a major medical foundation that provided both funding and technical assistance for the pilot project. But unlike previous outside interventions, this support came in response to a locally generated initiative rather than an externally imposed program. Crawford residents maintained control over the project's design, implementation, and evaluation. Spencer Hicks, a veteran who had struggled with both physical and mental health challenges since returning from Afghanistan, found himself recruited to help design the clinic's Veteran Services Program. His lived experience with the healthcare system's limitations, combined with leadership training he had received through the community development initiatives, made him uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between medical professionals and the community members they served. The clinic opened in the fall of 2004, serving not just Crawford, but a network of rural communities within a 30-mile radius. It operated on a model that combined fee-for-service medicine with community health education, preventive care programs, and social services coordination. The approach proved both financially sustainable and more effective than traditional rural healthcare delivery models. By the end of 2004, Crawford had become something unprecedented in rural American development. A community that had successfully transitioned from dependency to self-determination without sacrificing either its identity or its connections to external resources and opportunities. The transformation hadn't occurred through the abandonment of tradition or the wholesale adoption of outside models, but through the integration of local knowledge with external expertise in service of community-defined goals. Laura Bush made one final visit to Crawford in December 2004, arriving for the dedication of the new health clinic and the first anniversary celebration of what residents now called simply the transformation. She came not as the architect of change, but as a witness to what the community had accomplished through its own efforts and vision. The woman who had been criticized as too soft to make a difference stood before a gathering of more than 300 people, residents, visitors from other communities, development professionals, and media representatives who had come to document Crawford's unprecedented success. But instead of claiming credit or delivering a victory speech, she did what she had always done. She listened. "A year ago," Walter Lyons said from the podium at the community center, "I thought this whole thing was a mistake. I thought we were being taken advantage of by people who didn't understand what we were about. I was wrong about the people, but I wasn't wrong about the importance of staying true to who we are." He paused, looking out at faces that reflected the diversity of perspectives that had always existed in Crawford, but had rarely been acknowledged or valued. What Mrs. Bush understood, what took me too long to figure out, is that being true to who we are doesn't mean refusing to grow or change. It means taking control of how we grow and change. Denise Strong followed Walter to the podium, carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed. 18 months ago, I was just trying to survive. I was working 2 jobs, raising 3 kids alone, and feeling like I was failing at everything. Today, I'm the director of an organization that's helping other communities learn what we've learned. My kids are proud of what their mum does for work. She gestured toward the audience, where her children sat with other young people who had found reasons to envision futures in Crawford rather than automatic escape routes to distant cities. But the most important thing isn't what any of us accomplished individually, it's what we learned we could accomplish together. Alan Johnson spoke about the hardware store that had become a makerspace, about the relationships with customers who had become collaborators, about the discovery that serving a community meant much more than simply selling products. Barbara Jackson described education programs that had transformed not just individual students, but the community's understanding of learning and development. Dennis Porter talked about social networks that had become economic networks, about connections that had become the foundation for collective action and mutual support. As the evening progressed, speaker after speaker shared stories that illustrated a common theme. Crawford had not been saved by outside intervention, but had been empowered to save itself. The quiet woman who had initiated this transformation had understood something that eluded most development professionals and political leaders: that sustainable change comes not from the imposition of external solutions, but from the cultivation of local capacity to generate and implement community-owned solutions. Laura Bush's final remarks were characteristic of her approach throughout the Crawford initiative. She spoke briefly, humbly, and with genuine admiration for what the community had accomplished. "When I first came to Crawford," she said, "I saw a community with tremendous assets that weren't being recognized or utilized. Today, I see a community that has learned to see itself clearly and act on its own behalf." She paused, scanning the faces of people who had become not just policy success stories, but individuals she had come to know and respect. The lesson of Crawford isn't about what outside experts can do for rural communities. It's about what rural communities can do for themselves when they have the support and resources they need to pursue their own vision of development. As the celebration wound down and residents began cleaning up the community center, the transformation that had begun with skepticism and evolved through conflict to achievement felt not like an ending, but like a beginning. Crawford had learned something that would serve it well in future challenges. That true strength comes not from avoiding difficulties or depending on others to solve them, but from developing the capacity to face problems with confidence, creativity, and collaborative effort. The woman they had once dismissed as too soft had demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful leadership involves not commanding or controlling, but listening, connecting, and empowering others to discover their own strength. Laura Bush drove away from Crawford that December evening, knowing that she was leaving behind a community that no longer needed her intervention because it had learned to believe in and act upon its own potential. The transformation of Crawford would continue long after the cameras left and the development professionals moved on to other projects. Residents had internalized not just specific skills or programs, but an approach to community development that would serve them for generations. They had learned that true community resilience comes not from avoiding change, but from taking control of change in service of locally defined values and priorities. Crawford had become proof that sustainable rural development is possible, but only when it emerges from within communities themselves rather than being imposed from outside. The quiet action that had changed a town had revealed the power of patient, persistent and humble leadership that trusts in people's capacity to solve their own problems when given the tools, resources, and support they need to succeed. Most importantly, Crawford had demonstrated that being too soft to fit conventional expectations of leadership might actually be exactly the right approach for creating the kind of change that lasts, that serves communities rather than external agendas, and that honors both tradition and innovation in the pursuit of a better future. Has anyone ever underestimated your potential the way they underestimated Laura Bush? Share your story in the comments below, and remember that sometimes the quietest voices create the most powerful changes.